Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. So today our topic in the main is going to be about electoral reform. Now recently I was in a workshop, it was a media workshop. And at this media workshop, the person conducting the workshop gave a very interesting parable, a very interesting comparison if you like. And she said that, look, if you have to ask a child, what would you want? And the child will say, I want sweets. And you ask the child again, what would you want? And the child will say, I want sweets. Because that's what's attractive to the child. But as a parent, you know that you cannot only give your child sweets. You've got to give them, the salad, and you've got to give them the veggies, and you've got to give them the other stuff which is healthy and which is beneficial to them. And she went on to explain, and I found this example that she gave very interesting. She said that, look, media is in many ways in a similar situation. If you ask your audience, what do you want us to speak about? They'll only talk about the sensational issues. Let's talk about Andrew Tate. Let's talk about, this controversy or that controversy. And at times you've got to give them that. Like at times you've got to give the kid the sweet. But at times those in the media have to decide and say, this is important for people to know about. They've got to understand this. There's a lot of at stake when it comes to this, and therefore we've got to speak about it. So, if we were talking about something a little bit more sensational and I introduced the program, you would have sat up and said, okay, fine, let's listen to this, or let's watch this. Electoral reform, it's there, it's in the media, it's been spoken about, there are some concerns, vaguely you're aware, but we've got to understand what the dynamics are, and we've got to understand what is at stake. And that's why we are taking up this discussion very seriously on the program today with Neeshan Balton. He is from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. He's also with Defend Our Democracy. He features from time to time on the program. We appreciate the fact that he's taken the time today to speak to us. He had to juggle around a few commitments, but Neeshan, thank you so much, and good day, welcome.
Good day, welcome, and you deprived me of my sweets, which is why I am here.
Yeah, so, when we talk about electoral reform, I think the focus is currently on what just happened in Parliament and, the issues flowing from that. But I want to go back because recently at another event, I heard someone say that what happened in the early 90s in terms of the structure that was put in place, it was never envisaged to be there for long term. It was one election and you needed a framework for that election. And Mandela kind of spoke about this before he left office in 99. But for some reason, politicians never took it seriously. It was always on the back burner, even with the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission and all of those kind of things, or project. What happened in the early 90s, if you can recollect and from your perspective?
No, thank you very much. The negotiations around our transition started in 1990, continued in 91, 92, and then 93, you had the assassination of Chris Hani. The country was on tenterhooks, and it is in that context that there was insistence that the only way to diffuse the pressure point was to announce a date for the elections, because that would give people an idea that the negotiations was not going to be a prolonged set of discussions, but that it would come to an end. And at some point, ordinary people would have the right to vote for a party of their choice to shape the democracy that they wanted. And that decision was taken in April 93. But there was no electoral system to accommodate the majority of South Africans. And those discussions were only concluded around November of 93. And it was decided that the easiest way to hold those elections wouldn't be for people to be divided into constituencies, because that required the voters' roll, required people to be registered, but rather that you needed an electoral system that allowed for people to use their IDs, their passports, or any other document that would prove that they were South African citizens and who could vote anywhere in the country. And therefore, we ended up with a system that said you can vote for a political party. The party would choose its representatives. You don't have a say in that. And therefore, depending on the percentage of their vote, they get the percentage number of seats in parliament and in the provincial legislatures. And we then went for that system. It worked very well. The proportional system ensured that there were a multitude of party representatives. There was gender representativity, and minority parties had a space in parliament as well. The system itself was proclaimed in our constitution in '96 to be one of a temporary nature, and parliament itself would have then had to have done the work around developing a permanent and electoral system. When Madiba left parliament in '99, his words were, in his last speech to parliament, he said, we do need to ask whether we need to re-examine our electoral system. And this is the important part. So as to improve the nature of our relationship as public representatives with voters. Now, this is in November or December of 1999. He had already foreseen that the system itself was a temporary one and that needed to have been changed. Subsequent to that, the Minister of Home Affairs at the time, around about 2003, I think it was Prince Buthelezi, was in charge of Home Affairs, commissioned the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, and that report recommended a change to the electoral system to include constituencies as well as the party list system. And they came up with some models. That was rejected. A few years back, the Khalima Motlanthe report came out, again commissioned by Parliament, made almost the same recommendations. That again was rejected by Parliament. And lastly, we had the Ministerial Advisory Committee chaired by Vali Musa, and the majority of members in that commission again recommended a hybrid system, which included a constituency-based system. And that, again, the minister has thus far rejected, Parliament has rejected, and now goes to the National Council of Provinces. Essentially, what you have is a parliamentary system that political parties, by and large, don't want voters to have a say who their representatives should be, should merely just vote for a party, and the party will determine who the representatives are. And that's the end of your ability to hold them accountable.
So the reason they didn't pursue electoral reform, is it because they felt that the system, although it was envisaged to be a temporary one, was one that they benefited from more than the alternates that were being proposed?
No, precisely. I think it's not only parliamentarians or political parties. I think civil society as a whole and society as a whole, we went along with the system because it seemingly worked. What we didn't understand at the time was just how much it allowed political parties to almost assume levels of becoming immune to public criticism and accountability. And we saw it in the arms deal, you saw it in a number of other issues in Parliament, where what was very clearly wrong and not in the public interest didn't matter to those who were in Parliament. But by that time, the system had become entrenched. It became part of the voting culture in this country. And hence, I think only now that we've started to draw the links between the importance of good public representatives and poor governance that we are experiencing, I think that we've come to realize that there is this necessity to require a change in our electoral system, because it gives us an opportunity to change much of what is wrong in our society. Won't fix up everything, but allows for greater possibilities to fix up many of the wrongs that are going on in our governance, and I would argue across society as a whole.
So What has happened now that has brought it back into the under the microscope, if you like, into public debate? Is it that citizens then went to court and said that independents need to have a right to stand? Did that get the ball rolling again?
Very much so. So the New Nation movement went to the Constitutional Court, and they argued that it was unconstitutional for our electoral system not to allow an independent candidate to stand in provincial and national elections. Independents can stand in local government elections, and we've all seen how that works. But thus far, they were not able to stand in provincial and national elections. The court ruled in I think 2020 already that Parliament gave Parliament 24 months to amend the electoral legislation to allow for independents to participate. The minister for almost 18 months did nothing. The portfolio committee did nothing. Parliament itself didn't deliberate on this matter extensively. And by the time they woke up, they realized that they needed to ask the court for a further extension, which I'm not sure if I lost you.
No, I'm still with you. Yeah.
Okay. So Parliament had to give a further extension to the portfolio committee. The portfolio committee they claim that they had public hearings. Civil society argues that those public hearings were stage managed, filled with party political representatives. Secondly, in those hearings, they didn't present the two options that the Ministerial Advisory Committee gave them. They merely presented one option and got that option almost rubber stamped. And then all of the submissions made by various organizations to the portfolio committee were by and large ignored. And they have opted now for a form of electoral change which will accommodate independents, but in a way that makes it virtually impossible for them to compete. So if you stand as Moulana Ravat in Gauteng, you will have to compete across the whole of Gauteng against any established political party. You can't contest in a part of Gauteng where people might know you and where you might have a support base. You have to really contest across the whole of Gauteng. But before you even start, as Moulana Ravat, you will have to get between 8,000 or more people to sign a form that says they accept that you can stand in parliament. They have to give you their ID numbers. And people these days don't really want to give ID numbers for all kinds of stuff. And the IEC will have to verify whether those people are in fact registered on the voters roll. Now, if I register a political party tomorrow, I register Sean Bolton's party, I need 1,000 signatures only. Then there's the fee that you have to pay is much higher. Lastly, as Moulana Ravat, you stand in Gauteng, you get maybe 80,000 votes. That might get you one seat. If I stand as Sean Bolton's political party and somebody in my list gets 50,000 votes, that gives them a seat in the Gauteng legislature. So there's these kinds of inequalities that are built into the current bill in Parliament. But ultimately, what my main concern is that it doesn't really accommodate the need for voters to have a say on who their representative is, whether that representative comes from a political party or an independent. And it is that crucial element built into other aspects of how to make sure that the public representative represents your issues in Parliament. And if he or she fails, mechanisms to then recall them at some point during the 5-year term is just as important. So these are the weaknesses and the failures of the current bill that has unfortunately gone through Parliament, is now at the National Council of Provinces. And I hope that the National Council of Provinces, who have asked for public submissions, will take many of those submissions seriously as well.
So you're watching the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. We're speaking to the Kathrada Foundation's Neeshan Balton about electoral reform. And Neeshan has been giving us the context, the history, so that we get a full picture, and also simplifying it for us as we go along. Parliament has passed it, as you said, Neeshan, right? Does the NCOP have the ability to reject it? Or will there have to be a legal challenge for this to be, to be brought into question?
If the National Council of Provinces had been made up, the National Council of Provinces firstly have to represent the views and interests of their provinces.
Mhm.
Now, those who are going from Gauteng, we were told at the session that we held on Saturday with Mohammed Dengo, who's the ANC representative in the National Council of Provinces, that he essentially will get his instruction from his political party in Gauteng, but he listened to some of the issues that we had raised, but ultimately he will take his directive from the political party. And I assume many others who will go there on behalf of the province. So you haven't had in Gauteng the provincial legislature playing its role of convening public hearings on this, of getting the views and opinions of the citizens of this province. And hence political parties will give their representatives a mandate, and they will execute that mandate. So what I think is going to happen at the National Council of Provinces, they will most likely deal with some of the more visible deficiencies of this bill, like the numbers of signatures and deposits and everything else, and probably lower those in some cases. But they're not fundamentally going to change the system to introduce constituencies into it, which means that there are possibilities of a constitutional court challenge on the technicalities, but also on the broader intention of if you wanted to really have included independence meaningfully, then it would have required the introduction of a constituency system. Now, that could possibly be the legal challenge that I think different civil society organizations who have legal capacity are looking at, the different angles around which to mount a challenge once the president has signed off, and the latest that he has to sign off is on the 10th of December.
Now, let's talk a little bit about independent candidates and what are the pros and what are the cons. I suppose the obvious pros are that independence can stand, people can choose their own representatives, hold them to account. Some analysts have come out and said, but you know what, don't look at this as some sort of a silver bullet. You can't have a parliament full of independence. There won't be cohesion, there won't be synergy. Political parties will still play the dominant and the main role. It can also be abused. Political parties can put so-called independent candidates as fronts, but in reality, they act on the behest of those political parties. Someone gave the example and said, you can have a group of gangsters come together, collect 8,000 signatures, put down a couple of 100,000 rands that you need to put down and get someone to try now and represent their interests, which is not the interests of society. What's your assessment of the pros and cons? Are we understating the benefits of this part of the reform, or is it being overstated?
No, I think they point to possibilities of abuse, and we all need to be mindful that any system has these possibilities of abuse. But I start off from the premise of looking at what has worked in the last 28 years. We have had gangsters and crooks running political parties here. If you look at the people who are in Dubai, they literally ran our cabinet. They made not only political appointments, they made administrative appointments. Now, when you can do both political and administrative appointments and decide where tenders must go, that is the most glaring abuse of our electoral system. So yes, I think there are dangers in independence. But I want to remind people who will watch this. You had one member of parliament, though she wasn't an independent, but was a sole member of parliament for a number of years, Helen Suzman. And look at the work that she did as a sole member of parliament. And if you equate her with what an independent could or possibly do, you can see the potential that has. Again, it depends on the quality of person that should be available for voters to decide whether they would want to give that person their support. And that becomes, what is required with an electoral system is not just changing the ways in which people can stand for election, but it requires a huge effort to then go into the kind of voter education, which is not just about where to make your cross, but which is about how to decide who to vote for, how to question candidates, how to question political parties, and how to engage them around their commitments, and more so what to do about the commitments that they give after the elections itself, uh, which is what we don't do in the country. We tend to focus on the names of the person, any scandal that's associated with them, and we rarely have the opportunity to probe a candidate in the way in which many other constituency systems allow you to do. Our local government system has part of that, but the weakness of the system in local government is ultimately the party can withdraw a ward councillor if he or she decides to vote in the interest of that ward committee, of that ward area. And that's the biggest weakness. I think if that system is broken, to really allow for a ward representative to take up issues which are in the interest of the community, it forces the party to then align its positions with the voters that it wants the support of. So I think that there are huge possibilities for improving the quality of our democracy if we amend the electoral system. As I said, there are inherent dangers, but those dangers exist currently in our current political system.
So there's been a lot of focus on independent candidates, and we can understand. I mean, it all flowed from that court ruling, as we spoke earlier on. Is there more to electoral reform than just allowing independent candidates to stand in provincial and national elections? What are the other options that are being discussed and being debated and that need to make their way into electoral reform in the long term for us to have an overall better system?
So the how we vote is our voting system. It's the who we vote for that I think is now what we're beginning to focus on. It's why we vote that needs to become part of the political education work that must be ongoing. And I think it's the most important part is what happens after the election, is what are the accountability systems and mechanisms that we think are required to make public representatives and public institutions more accountable. Now, that goes with issues of simple things like transparency, making sure that all budget decisions, all tenders and so forth become public documents and easily accessible to the public, voting records of members in and out of parliament and legislatures and council to be made more public, so that we know who they voted for, why they voted for particular things. And lastly is compulsory constituency systems of report back meetings, of accountability. So for example, if to make this practical, before parliament approves a budget, political parties deliberate on it. Communities across this country don't get involved at all through the parliamentary system. If you had a constituency system, and if it were compulsory that your member of parliament needed to convene sessions of members of that constituency about what the priorities of that budget needs to be, it makes a huge change. Post the budget, you need to have a compulsory report back meeting on what that budget is about, where is the money going, how will it be spent, what are the big projects, and if those projects exist in your area, how exactly do you get involved in monitoring it? So the electoral change won't work unless there's a change of mind about the level of active citizenry that is required to make the system work. If we just change the electoral system and all we do is we vote once in 5 years, then you can be rest assured that the system will soon be corrupted because it hasn't got the checks and balances that comes from people being actively involved in the day-to-day politics of their city, of their province, and of their national government.
So will that also speak to the concerns around coalition governments? Because we see what's happening in Johannesburg, we saw what happened in Ekurhuleni. It's not only a post-2021 local government phenomenon. We saw quite a bit of that happening also between 2016 and 2021, from the time we were introduced to coalition governments at local government level. What kind of electoral reform then is required at that level?
Well, I think the coalitions at municipal levels, firstly, there's no legislation that guides any of this. I think what has also happened is that parties that get a minuscule amount of votes exercise much more influence and power than they would have in any other system. So I think that there needs to be some kind of thresholds about involvement. But I think the simplest system at the municipal level, and it already exists in legislation, is to have proportionally representative municipal executives. So the executive should not just be on the basis of a mayor, but the executive should be made up of parties who get above a particular threshold. And if a party obviously gets over 50%, then they constitute, or 60%, that they would constitute the majority of members in the mayoral committee. But in the UK and other studies that we have done, parties who get 20 and 15% of the vote are included in the mayoral committees, not as part of as a coalition agreement, but as part of the constitution or the governance model for local government, because that takes away the kind of bartering that I think you currently see. But I think that the fundamental weakness that we have, if you take Johannesburg, there is no citywide coalition or body of civil society, ratepayers, or interested organizations. That's something we're thinking about in the Kathrada Foundation. But in the absence of that, all we can sit and do is watch the changing of chairs, the changing of mayoral committees. There is no external pressure on whoever is in office to stick to the commitments of service delivery, of clean governance, of efficient governance, and to then use the power of citizens to withdraw our support if, in fact, the city crumbles or collapses. In a number of other parts of the country here, people have already set up alternative models where they put their money into trust accounts, they provide services, or they have even gone to the point. I was reading a case yesterday where this particular city has got a court order forcing the municipality to almost resign and for it to take over the delivery of services. Now, that you can only do when you have the kind of infrastructure of civil society in a more coordinated and organized way. I think we will get there, but I think it needs to happen much sooner than later.
You are watching the Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat show here on Hilaal TV. We are speaking to Neeshan Balton from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. We're talking about electoral reform. We've spoken about what happened in the early 90s, the kind of framework that was developed then, which was meant to be a temporary measure. Then it just remained because it suited the interests of political parties. There was the Van Zyl Slabbert report, but nothing came much of it. The Motlanthe report, as Neeshan has spoken about. And then we spoke about independent candidates and the pros and cons there, and what's happening now at the NCOP, now that it's been passed by Parliament. Also coalitions, and Neeshan was explaining there about legislation that is required. So, Neeshan, then as civil society, how do we then take up the struggle for electoral reform? We saw what has happened now when citizens went to court about independent candidates at provincial and national elections. They got the ruling. Even though that which Parliament has passed is not what is required, but the process started. If we look at electoral reform broadly and some of the things that we've been touching on and speaking on, what kind of mechanism is required now from ground level? What kind of cohesion and synergy is required to start pushing for this?
I think, Moulana, it starts off with you as an individual asking yourself just one couple of simple questions. What would make a good public representative for me? What is it that I'm looking for? What work do I expect them to be doing? And how do I want them to involve me? And how do I think I should be holding them accountable? If we start answering those basic questions as individuals and as communities and as organizations, I think we'll begin to develop the set of ideas that become community-wide or country-wide around these very basics. And unless we start talking about the quality of public representatives and begin to then think about how we use that as a tool to evaluate who we then vote for, irrespective of the system that comes through, I think we're not going to make much headway if we're just focusing on changing the model of elections. So the point I'm making is that there's work that we need to do as individual citizens and as communities and community organizations about talking about democracy and what it means for us. And what I've been doing in a number of meetings is really just asking what is the importance of politics in our day-to-day lives? Because I think that there's another issue that needs to be spoken about is the cynicism of politics, about politics in this country, and almost the kind of disdain towards it. Because we make the mistake of confusing party politics and politics. Now, when you talk about politics and understand that politics today determines the price of petrol, the price of bread, the price of your clothing, the choice of food that you have, I mean, just about everything in your day-to-day lives is politically determined in some way or the other, which means that we need to be paying much more attention to political decisions and political choices and political actors. And I think if we begin to change that kind of mindset about just how important politics is to our day-to-day lives, we would then begin to come to the conclusions that we need better people in politics. We need better people in the public service across all levels, which is the second kind of misconception that we need to start breaking. Government matters, public service matters, and we therefore need, I mean, I'm so glad that there's been this new thinking about ending cadre deployment so that it opens up the space for the best possible people to go into serving our people through the public service, either as public servants or as public representatives, which then comes to, I think, the points you're talking about. How do we then get involved as citizens? I think it's about then, whichever electoral system comes about, is collectively as communities and as organizations, is probing these kinds of options, political options that come up, political solutions that come up to important questions, which we don't ask in elections. Who has the best answer to unemployment in this country? Who has the most realistic plan to deal with unemployment and poverty in this country? Who has the most credible people to solve those particular problems? And which political party or candidate is willing to say that if I fail, I step down or I give you the right to recall me in whatever way is necessary. So I think we need a different kind of discussion around politics and the importance of public servants and public representatives before we even get to who you vote for.
Well, talking about voting, right? 2024 is not too far away. There has been speculation that if there's a legal challenge to the bill passed in Parliament, that it could delay the elections, or that challenge, irrespective, the IEC won't have enough time to put in place a proper framework for the next provincial and national government elections to accommodate for independence adequately. And Musi Memani seems to be suggesting that's why he's gone the route that he didn't want to go in the first place, because he's kind of accepted that the 2024 is too early for us to see the kind of change that we wanted to see, especially with independence. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think firstly, a constitutional court challenge, a legal challenge, is almost inevitable. Whether it's going to be a challenge that focuses on the very narrow technicalities, which might mean that the court is easily able to pronounce on those things. If the challenge is about the more fundamental change that's required to our electoral system, that could possibly have a number of scenarios. You know, the courts could either instruct Parliament or government to find the resources to enable the IEC to speedily do the kinds of work that is involved in demarcations and so forth. But the courts are very hesitant about interfering in that kind of way in the domain of governance that is not strictly judicial. But they have done it. They've done it with the SASSA grants, where the courts instructed the Department of Social Development to report back to it on a monthly basis almost on progress. The same with the antiretrovirals. It was the courts who had to instruct a change of policy by government. So those kinds of scenarios are possible. What I don't think, what I think would work in the interest of democracy, if the president doesn't sign this and he refers it back to Parliament and says, fix up these particular areas, but puts in some kind of legal enforceable obligation that Parliament, political parties commit themselves to fundamental electoral reform by 2029, then I think we would be on the right track. The president's response to the Zondo Commission hints at some kind of possibilities of a greater openness towards discussions about electoral reform. But I think the concern of many in civil society is that that kind of commitment almost disappears after the election unless there is some kind of legally enforceable binding agreement between Parliament, political parties, civil society in its widest form as a commitment to electoral reform. What that will allow is for the country to go into a nationwide conversation on the kind of electoral reform, examining all of the different models, and the possibility of a referendum then being used to make a final determination on a model for electoral reform that would allow us all to participate and be bound by the outcome of that referendum. That's what I think would be the most feasible solutions to the problems that we are going to be confronting in the next couple of months.
Finally then, Neeshan, on a more general note, we know we are weeks away from the ANC's elective conference. The last time we had you on the program in studio, you mentioned that you've long cut your membership card, or you've let it lapse and not renew it. Is the foundation taking interest in what's going to happen at that elective conference? Even if one is not a member, even if one doesn't support the ANC, they are still the ruling party.
So we have to be mindful of political developments across all political parties. Previously, the ANC invited the foundation to its national conferences to put up the exhibitions of the foundation, which we took up, and many of our staff observed the proceedings. But we also guard very jealously our non-partisan position, even though many on our board are ANC members. The foundation as an institution is not aligned to the ANC. So if they invite the foundation, we most likely will attend, and I'm sure that will be to do our exhibition there. We are also mindful that Ahmed Kathrada, if he were alive, would most likely not have renounced his ANC membership and would have attended this conference if we were invited and if we had been able to attend. So that he would have done in his individual capacity. Now, I think just to summarize, this is an important conference, not only for the ANC, there's important implications and consequences for the country. And we all therefore have to pay attention to it. But we don't have to be uncritical of the decisions that they make. And neither do we have to just take it as given that they have to become policy and laws for the entire country. We need to work out what are the good things that will emerge from this conference that we think are in the interest of the country as a whole and rally behind those. Those which are obviously don't make sense or are not in the interest of the country and are purely in the interest of the ANC, that we must reject. I'm sure that they are going to want to mount a huge campaign to change the Party Funding Act, and that's something that we must change. If the ANC decides on a basic income grant and works out the modalities for that, that would be in the interest of the wider country and would be good for the country, and that's something possibly the foundation would want to support. So we would evaluate each of the policy pronouncements on their merits and not because they necessarily come out of the ANC.
Neeshan Balton, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Always wonderful being on your show. Thanks, Moulana.
Have a great day. Go on.
Thank you.
Well, that was Neeshan Balton from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation having a discussion with us around electoral reform. It's one of the things that they, and together with Defend Our Democracy, are looking at with keen interest, and it's obvious why. These things may seem a little technical in nature sometimes, but they are important, like I said in my introduction. Let me leave you on a bit of a spiritual note, because as Muslims, as believers, we look for that spiritual angle or perspective in everything. And as we were going through the discussion, I was reminded of a very short yet profound statement of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A'malukum ummalukum. Your leaders will be a reflection of your deeds. Your leaders will be a reflection of your deeds. Of course, when leaders fall short, we need to call them out. Of course, when leaders are corrupt, we need to condemn that. Of course, when leaders don't fulfill their promises, we need to make them feel the pain at the ballot. All of that on its place, but also as a point of reflection for ourselves, that in the main, your leaders are a reflection of your own actions. Your leaders political leaders come from within our own communities. Where do our ward councillors come from? Where do the ministers come from? Where do the premiers come from? Where does the president come from? They don't come from space. They're not aliens. They come from within our own communities. And many of the things that we find plaguing the political landscape also plagues our communities and societies. Maybe the consequences are not as significant, but it's there nonetheless. Until next week, inshallah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.